Hello and welcome. Thank you for being here today. Today I am going to be discussing a project that explored the relationship between self-compassion and disordered eating behaviors. Disordered eating behavior describes a pattern of eating behavior that includes behaviors such as binging and/or purging, the use of laxatives, avoiding food, and/or engaging in caloric restriction. Self-compassion is comprised of 6 intercorrelated components that measure on 3 domains. The first of which is self-kindness versus self-judgment, which involves being kind to oneself in times of distress instead of being overly harsh or self-critical. The second is common humanity versus isolation, which involves being accepting of one's own flaws and failings instead of thinking that they're uniquely your own and isolating because of them. And lastly, there's mindfulness versus over-identification, which involves being aware of one's personal thoughts and feelings instead of letting them take control and consume you. The scale most commonly used to measure self-compassion is the 26-item self-compassion scale created by Kristin Neff in 2003. This scale originally proposed and validated a 6-factor hierarchical model structure, which supports the use of a total scale sum in addition to individual subscale sums. As the scale has become increasingly popular, translations into other languages have begun occurring more and more frequently. But in some of these cases, the 6-factor hierarchical model either does not fit or it fits the data poorly. In these instances, exploratory and confirmatory factor analyses have been run and support the use of a 2-factor conceptualization, grouping the positive items onto one factor and the negative items, which are typically reverse scored in the total sum, onto another. In the context of disordered eating behaviors and eating disorders, low levels of self-compassion have been linked to things such as greater rates of self-objectification, greater body image dissatisfaction, greater thin ideal internalization, and these participants are more likely to be self-critical, whereas participants who report higher levels of self-compassion also report lower instances of disordered eating behaviors, lower instances of body image dissatisfaction, lower instances of self-objectification, and these participants are least self-critical. So while the strength of these associations may fluctuate, they have been demonstrated in both clinical and community samples, with reviews and several other studies coming to the same or similar conclusions, that self-compassion is a protective factor against the development of a diagnosable eating disorder. However, one of the major limitations of a lot of these studies is that their focus is on primarily white, Caucasian, or Western European samples. As there's mixed evidence supporting the factor structure in diverse samples, we first aim to explore the factor structure of the SES-26 in our sample. We hypothesized that the 6-factor hierarchical structure would fit our data the best as we were using the English translated version. We also hypothesized that high levels of self-compassion would predict lower instances of disordered eating behavior and vice versa, which is consistent with a decade's worth of previous literature. There were a total of 402 community participants in the present sample, though 374 remained for analyses after excluding missing cases. All participants were females between the ages of 18 and 30, and as you can see, we did a fairly decent job gathering a racially diverse sample. 2 main measures were used in the present study. The first is the 26-item eating attitudes test, which has been shown to be a reliable measure of disordered eating behavior in both clinical and community samples. In the present sample, our E26 scores had to be log transformed due to their high kurtosis levels. The second measure used is Neff's self-compassion scale, which as you can see was split into the 2-factor conceptualization. Both subscales showed acceptable reliability in the present sample. Higher scores on each measure indicate a greater presence of that construct. While Neff's total sum incorporates reverse scored self-criticism, we decided not to take this step and allow higher criticism scores to represent being highly self-critical, as we were using the 2-factor model instead. Confirmatory factor analysis results reveal that the 2-factor conceptualization fit our data the best. The original 6-factor hierarchical model would not run in the present sample, and the 1-factor model, which would have allowed us to still use a total scale sum, fit the data poorly. Thus, future regression analyses examine the relationship between self-compassion and disordered eating behavior using the 2-factor conceptualization shown here. A significant moderation effect of self-criticism in the relationship between self-compassion and disordered eating behaviors was found. Probing for interactions revealed that self-compassion was a significant predictor of disordered eating behaviors across all levels of self-criticism. Among our highly self-critical participants, each unit increase in self-compassion scores predicted a 3% increase in EAT scores, compared to the 1 or 2% increase which is observed when criticism is low or average, respectively. Findings suggest that even when self-compassion is high, which you can see on the far right side of the figure, participants who report being highly critical of themselves, which are represented by the green line in the figure, are more likely to report greater instances of disordered eating. So long story short, neither of our hypotheses were supported. In our sample, the two-factor conceptualization fit our data the best. And when this model was used, self-compassion was shown to be a significant predictor of disordered eating instead of a buffer against it. Our study was the first, to our knowledge, to examine the relationship between self-compassion and disordered eating in this way. And our findings indicate that self-compassion may not be as protective as researchers previously believed when you're using the two-factor conceptualization over a total scale sum. Perhaps the use of reverse-scored self-criticism may be serving as a methodological barrier to the measure, and separating them into two distinct constructs in the future may be more applicable. At least in the context of disordered eating, it is entirely possible that self-criticism matters more than self-compassion, though future research utilizing the two-factor self-compassion model is still needed. Thank you. Any questions?